Time now for French Connections, our weekly look at the intricacies of life here in France with Florence Villemino. Good to see you. This week, we're going to focus on a controversial bill that's set to be debated in Parliament. It's aimed at combating extremist ideology and reinforces the founding principles of the French Republic, particularly France's special brand of state secularism known as laïcité. Analysts say it could be one of the most important pieces of legislation of Emmanuel Macron's presidency.
That's right. The French government says this draft legislation is nothing less than necessary for peaceful coexistence in France. It touches on some of the most sensitive issues of contemporary France and has already provoked a lot of reactions and misinterpretations abroad. So it's important to take the time to look at it in detail, starting with the title that you can see right here. You can see it's a bit of a mouthful. It's called the Projet de loi confortant le respect des principes de la République. So the bill is aimed at reinforcing or strengthening the respect of the principles of the French Republic. But what's interesting more than what's in the title is what's not in the title, because originally it was actually labeled a law against religious separatism and in particular radical Islam. But you won't find the words separatism or radical Islam or any other religion in this text, even though that's precisely what it's about.
Now, if you read between the lines, Flo, it's clear that this draft legislation is aimed at combating extremist ideology that has taken many, many lives here in France.
Absolutely. It comes in a particular context because France is a vibrant, multicultural country. It's home to the largest Muslim and Jewish populations in Europe, but France is also clearly in a crisis. More than 260 people have been killed in Islamist terrorist attacks since 2012. And shortly after the bill was announced came the jihadist-inspired beheading of a teacher, Samuel Paty, as well as the deadly knife attack in a church in Nice. Now, the government says there is an urgent need to fight what it says is a growing separatism in France that spreads terrorist ideology and violates the egalitarian principles of the French Republic.
I mean, that's where this draft law comes in, because it's aimed at, reducing the space that radicals have to deviate from French ideology and thinking and values. There are some 50 articles in this bill. Can you talk us through some of them?
Well, it covers a lot of ground. We won't have time to get into all of it, but let's just take a look at some of the key measures. For instance, the legislation will curb online hate speech of the kind that led to Monsieur Paty's death. It will also ban all public sector employees, so including private contractors, from wearing religious clothing in the workplace, for instance, people who work for the National Railway Company, the SNCF. There are also articles aimed at clamping down on polygamy, which is illegal in France, as well as forced marriages and doctors who provide so-called virginity certificates before traditional marriages. Now, a lot of the law is also aimed at regulating religious and other community associations which receive public subsidies. They will have to sign a declaration of allegiance to the values of the Republic, and there will be strict controlling of their funding. For instance, mosques will have to declare foreign funding of more than 10,000 euros. But there are other measures as well. For instance, local councils will be banned from agreeing to religious demands, for instance, having female-only openings for swimming pools, for instance.
Now, the government here in France insists that this bill is not singling out Muslims, but many perceive it that way.
Absolutely. Critics say that this bill is part of a culture of racism and Islamophobia in France. It's been condemned by countries like Turkey as well as other Muslim countries. The government, meanwhile, insists that this bill will only target Islamist extremists, not Islam in general, but it's having a hard time controlling the message.
Ce à quoi nous devons nous attaquer, c'est le séparatisme islamiste.
Quand on évoque le séparatisme, il n'y a pas que l'islamisme radical. Il y a d'autres choses. Et l'idée, c'est sans doute de ne pas être trop restrictif, même si ce texte vise essentiellement, bien sûr, l'islamisme radical.
Mais pourquoi ?
Ce projet de loi n'est pas un texte contre les religions, ni contre la religion musulmane en particulier.
Macron and his ministers have been accused of pandering to the right ahead of the 2022 presidential election. But what's interesting is that critics on the right say that this bill doesn't go far enough.
Comme d'habitude, la montagne va accoucher d'une souris et les propositions nous semblent être évidemment, encore une fois, des gouttes d'eau face à l'océan des difficultés qui sont devant nous sur ces sujets-là.
Now, Flo, the French President Emmanuel Macron argues that these new laws are needed to reinforce France's secular system, but we already have laws in place for that.
Absolutely, and we've already spoken about it before, but it's worth remembering that France's brand of secularism, laïcité, which is our word du jour, is very particular. It's actually central to how France defines itself. There's a law from 1905 which guarantees the separation of church and state. It guarantees a freedom of conscience and the neutrality of the state when it comes to religion. It really is the cornerstone of the French Republic to many people. But critics say that instead of defending personal and religious freedom, laïcité actually attacks them, and in particular, Islam. Now, what's interesting is to look at opinion polls. A majority of French people believe that French secularism is actually under attack, and an overwhelming majority of people actually support the government in its efforts to clamp down on separatism. But, and this is very important, there are also calls for socio-economic measures to fight discrimination, particularly in the job market, in the housing market. And Macron himself has said that France suffers from its own form of separatism in neglecting the marginalization of some Muslims. And he's vowed to hold a national consultation on discrimination because it's very important that it is also urgent to address this other side of this very thorny issue.
A very thorny issue indeed, Flo. Thank you very much for that. And that's all we have time for in this edition of French Connections. In the meantime, you can tweet your questions to Flo, and the address is @FloVilmino, and check out our website, france24.com.